In the last video, we took a look at some of the different materials that are going to be used for this exercise. We're now going to get started writing some code to implement our Node class API. Now the Node API is going to have just one function associated with it, which is the constructor function. Remember that a node in a linked list essentially just contains some amount of data and a reference to the next node along the chain. And so it really has essentially no functionality tied to it. It's just a little container that contains some amount of data. To that end, let's take a look at some of the documentation here because there is one thing about it that is a little confusing. So notice how the arguments to the constructor function are supposed to be some data that the node should contain and store. And then the second argument, which is an optional argument, is a reference to another node. Now here's the thing that's confusing about this. This second argument right here is supposed to be a reference to the next node along the chain. Now that might not sound like the weirdest thing, but let's put this into diagram format and then I think you'll understand what's going on. So we're going to take a look at a diagram that simulates this code example over here on the right. So see the code example right here? We're going to look at a diagram to follow exactly what that does. Okay, so first three lines right here sets up something called node 1 or N1. We call the node constructor and we pass in some data to store of hi. So the node, that constructor inside the node class runs and it assigns to its data property the string hi. And then to the next property, which is supposed to contain a reference to the next node along the chain, it contains null. There is no other node that it is pointing to here. So no other node is currently associated with this chain. Then immediately after that, we declare a second node. This second node takes in the string there as the first argument, and then as a second argument, it takes in node 1. So notice node 1 right there. That says just n, it should be node 1 like so. When the constructor runs with node 1, it's going to set up node 2, and on node 2, N1 is going to be set up as the next property. And so after all this code right here runs, we would imagine that this right here is node 2. So I'm going to drag node 2 over here, and it's going to end up looking like this. So the reason that I kind of focus on this argument right here is that this second argument sets up the next node along the chain, which is a little bit counterintuitive. You might think that it's supposed to set up the node like before it, but no, it sets up the next node along the chain. So essentially just take this N1 right here, or this node that we're passing in, and assign it to the next property of the node that we are creating. That's pretty much it. Okay, so with that in mind, let's flip on over to our code editor. Now for this one exercise and maybe the next one or two, just to get started on a strong foot, we're gonna do these together. And then I'll kind of cut you loose for some of the kind of later ones. But for these first few, it's really important that we start off on the same footing because the tests that we are putting together or the tests that are running over this example are expecting some very specific property names and whatnot. So I just want to make sure that these first couple exercises or these first couple of functions are put together very precisely. All right, so in the node class, we are going to define our constructor function. Remember, this is going to be executed anytime we create a new instance of a node. So we're going to use it to do some initialization of a node. The node will be called with two properties, data and the next node along the chain. Remember, like we just said, like we just looked at on the diagram, this is supposed to be the next node, the one that comes after the one that we are creating. So we're going to take that data right there and we are going to assign it to the data property of our node. So we'll say this.data equals data. One thing I want to reiterate, we just looked at this on the code example just a moment ago, but just to reiterate, there's nothing special about calling this data right here. It's just convention that we usually store any data associated to a node on the data property. Next, we are going to assign the next property of this node. So we'll say this.next is next, like so. Okay, so there's one last thing we need to be aware of here, and that is the case in which someone does not pass in a next node. And that actually just happened in the code snippet that we were just looking at. So it is totally fine to create a new node that does not have a node after it. So notice that we did not pass in a second argument here. Now again, by convention, this is entirely a convention thing. For the last node on a chain, we usually set the next to refer to null if there's no other nodes in the chain. And we do null rather than undefined. In general, whenever you see the property undefined, it usually has the connotation of meaning, hey, this property has not been set, like no developer, no engineer has set this property. But the null value kind of has the connotation of this property has been set and it has been specifically set to be undefined. So remember, null and undefined in JavaScript are extremely similar, but null kind of has the connotation of we specifically set this to be nothing at all. So in the case that someone creates a new node but does not pass in a next node, we're going to default the value of next to be null, like so. So if anyone makes a node but does not pass in a next one to link on, we're going to just default it and say it should be null. And so this .next will end up being null. All right, so that's our first constructor right here. That's our first little piece of a linked list. Let's check out our test really quickly. If we flip back over here, you'll see that the test that was failing is now passing. So if we scroll up a little bit, it'll say our test for a node. It has the properties data and next, which is great. Okay, so that is the setup for a node. So let's take a break right here. In the next section, we're going to continue by working on the implementation of our linked list. And that's where things are going to start to get really interesting. So quick break, and we'll pick it up in the next section.